With the looming threat of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs, a Buy Canadian movement has picked up across the country. You may have noticed it when you go into grocery stores or supply shops, a tag that tells you if the product you're about to pick up is made in Canada.
President Donald Trump is threatening to impose a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States.
Imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, and that has some shoppers here thinking twice about what they buy at the grocery store and which brands they are supporting.
What if the pressure designed to corner Canada is now silently turning back on the United States? And that reversal is already reflected in concrete figures that are becoming increasingly difficult to overlook. For a considerable period, Washington's approach seemed straightforward and deliberate, with tariffs deployed as bargaining tools, pressure applied incrementally, and the assumption that Canada would eventually absorb the strain without fundamentally altering the relationship. But that assumption began fracturing the moment actual data started rolling in. Because rather than showing Canada buckling under pressure, it revealed something far more unsettling, which was movement on both ends of the border. U.S. exports to Canada declined by over $13 billion, while Canadian imports into the U.S. dropped by nearly $30 billion. That is not statistical noise or brief fluctuation. That is genuine economic contraction between two of the most tightly linked economies on the planet. When figures of that magnitude shift within a short window, it indicates that something deeper is transforming beneath the surface, something that policymakers cannot simply brush aside or outlast. Initially, this appeared to be a routine trade disagreement, with each side rolling out countermeasures and working to shield domestic industries. Canada's response was characterized as measured, with officials noting that parallel policies already existed on the American side. But what followed did not resemble a short-lived reaction, because rather than sharp and erratic moves, Canada's response began taking form in layers, with policy, consumer behavior, and industry choices all trending in the same direction. That convergence is where the real transformation began, because this was never solely about tariffs. It was about the assumption embedded within those tariffs, the belief that pressure would remain one-sided and that Canada would quietly absorb the shock without restructuring how it purchases, sells, and invests. That assumption overlooks something essential, which is how rapidly coordinated responses can begin reshaping an economic relationship when both parties are deeply intertwined with one another. The first layer of that transformation surfaced in consumer behavior, not in dramatic or loud ways, but in steady, everyday choices that gradually started accumulating. Canadian shoppers began scrutinizing labels more closely, steering away from American products and gravitating toward domestic alternatives, not out of obligation, but because the sentiment had shifted. And once consumer habits change voluntarily, they tend to persist far longer than any policy adjustment. That sentiment is not abstract. It shows up in real voices like Scott Proudfit, who openly stated that when it comes to grocery shopping, anything American is off the table for him, making it clear that this goes beyond supporting local goods and extends to deliberately sidestepping U.S. products. When that mindset ripples across thousands or millions of shoppers, it quietly reshapes demand in ways that are extremely difficult to undo. Simultaneously, government policy began reinforcing that shift, not through abrupt bans or aggressive steps that would spark immediate pushback, but through targeted decisions that gradually steered contracts and procurement toward domestic companies. Large-scale purchasing began leaning more decisively toward Canadian suppliers, trimming dependence on American imports without triggering immediate disruption. And that variety of steady, sustained pressure compounds over time rather than producing a single defining headline. But then came a move that was impossible to overlook, when American alcohol was pulled entirely from major provincial shelves across Canada. Not reduced or restricted, but completely removed from stores, effectively dismantling a market worth roughly $1 billion almost overnight. That decision sent a crystal-clear signal, demonstrating that access to Canadian markets could shift swiftly and decisively. U.S. producers felt the consequences of that lost demand almost immediately. This is where the situation begins to accelerate, because the pressure is no longer flowing from one direction or one sector. It is arriving from multiple layers simultaneously. When exports fall, companies feel it directly. When contracts migrate, entire industries absorb the impact. And when consumer behavior shifts, it amplifies the effect across the whole system, converting what might have been a temporary dispute into something far more structural. At the same time, broader economic indicators are reinforcing this transformation, with Canada steadily reducing its reliance on the United States as its primary trade partner. The share of Canadian exports heading to the U.S. has already begun declining, sliding from roughly 76% down toward approximately 72%. And even a few percentage points at that scale translate into tens of billions of dollars being redirected toward new markets and new partnerships. Once those fresh trade relationships begin to take shape, they are not easily dismantled, because companies invest in new logistics, new supply chains, and new agreements, and those investments are constructive for the long haul. That means the longer this shift continues, the more difficult it becomes to return to the previous equilibrium, even if tariffs are eventually scaled back or removed entirely. Meanwhile, the pressure is not contained to trade flows alone, because it is also being magnified by global events, particularly the disruption stemming from the war in Iran, which has affected the supply of energy, aluminum, fertilizer, and other key commodities. These disruptions introduce volatility into global markets, and in that kind of environment, stability becomes a significant advantage, which is precisely the positioning Canada is working to establish. That point was made directly by Steve Verhoeven, Canada's chief trade negotiator from 2017 to 2021, who helped construct the current trade framework and now contends that time is actually working in Canada's favor. According to Verhoeven, the pressure bearing down on the United States is not easing. It is expected to intensify over time, particularly as global uncertainty continues to mount and supply chains remain unsettled. He also noted that the Trump administration's current tariff strategy has not delivered the results it was projected to generate, particularly regarding the revival of U.S. manufacturing jobs, which was one of the central objectives behind the policy. Rather than setting off a significant industrial resurgence, the tariffs have introduced elevated costs and uncertainty, which are now feeding back into the broader economy. That feedback loop is growing more visible as concerns escalate within the United States itself, including among Federal Reserve officials who have cautioned that global instability combined with supply disruptions could push inflation higher and force more difficult decisions around interest rates. When trade policy begins influencing inflation expectations and monetary policy, it extends well beyond a simple economic instrument and becomes part of a far larger system of pressure. And all of this is unfolding at a pivotal moment, because the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement is approaching its formal review, with July 1st marking 6 years since the agreement entered into force. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has already signaled that the United States intends to outline its position on the agreement by June 1st, while also conceding that not every issue is likely to be settled immediately. That uncertainty surrounding negotiations adds yet another layer of complexity, because it means decisions are being made in an environment where the balance of pressure is already shifting, and both sides are entering discussions with a very different set of expectations than they held at the start of this dispute. And that is where the shift becomes even more consequential, because once economic pressure begins blending into strategic decisions, it ceases to be a short-term disagreement and starts becoming something that reshapes long-term alliances, particularly in areas once considered stable and untouchable. One of the clearest illustrations of this is now playing out in Canada's defense sector, where a decision that might once have been driven purely by performance and cost is now deeply intertwined with sovereignty, control, and trust. Sweden's Saab has entered that space with a deliberate offer, proposing not only its Gripen fighter jets, but also something far more strategic, which is a sovereign data center to be constructed in Montreal, designed to keep all mission-critical data, intelligence, and operational systems entirely within Canadian borders. That proposal is framed as a distinct advantage, and it directly challenges the architecture underpinning the American-made F-35 program, where data is largely stored and managed through systems connected to Lockheed Martin facilities in Fort Worth, Texas. In a different political climate, that arrangement might not have raised as many concerns. But right now, with tensions elevated and trust being questioned more openly, the prospect of sensitive military data residing outside national borders has become a considerably weightier issue than it once was. According to Saab's proposal, the entire fighter mission system, communications, and technical data would be hosted inside Canada, staffed by personnel carrying appropriate security clearance, ensuring that critical information never crosses the border. That degree of control extends beyond technical preference. It speaks directly to sovereignty, because in modern defense systems, data is as vital as the aircraft itself. And whoever governs that data ultimately determines how those systems evolve and function. This is where concerns surrounding U.S. legislation like the Cloud Act begin entering the conversation, because such laws can permit American authorities to request access to data stored on servers under U.S. jurisdiction, even if that data belongs to another nation. For a country like Canada, which has long operated in close coordination with the United States through NORAD and other joint frameworks, that possibility introduces a layer of uncertainty that did not carry the same weight previously. Experts like Daniel Aria from the Center for International Governance Innovation have highlighted that while Canada and the United States will continue cooperating closely due to geography and shared security interests, the current political environment is compelling a deeper question about trust. And that question is not confined to one administration or one policy cycle, because the concern centers on long-term trajectory and whether dependence on external systems creates vulnerabilities that stretch well beyond defense. Alongside this, there is a technological dimension that makes the stakes even higher, because the data gathered by modern fighter jets is not only utilized for operations. It is also leveraged to train artificial intelligence systems, identify patterns, and enhance future capabilities. If that data is governed by one country or one company, it generates a competitive imbalance because it means future advancements are being constructed on information that is not fully shared. That is why Saab's offer reaches beyond selling aircraft. It aligns directly with Canada's broader economic and strategic objectives, particularly under Prime Minister Mark Carney's emphasis on strengthening domestic industry and preserving control over critical infrastructure. The proposal includes assembling the jets within Canada, generating employment, developing local expertise, and ensuring that a meaningful share of the economic value remains inside the country rather than flowing outward. And this is not a minor transaction by any measure, because the package under discussion encompasses 72 Gripen E and F fighter jets alongside 6 GlobalEye airborne early warning and control aircraft, representing an enormous investment that would shape Canada's defense and industrial foundation for decades. When decisions of that scale begin incorporating sovereignty and data control alongside cost and performance, it reflects a shift in priorities that reaches far beyond conventional procurement. Meanwhile, the F-35 program, despite being among the most sophisticated fighter platforms in existence, has faced its own set of concerns over the years, particularly around data management and system vulnerabilities. Reports have drawn attention to how the jet's logistics and maintenance system collect substantial volumes of data, including flight paths, mission profiles, and technical performance metrics, raising questions about how that data is stored, shared, and protected. Although Lockheed Martin has stated that it furnishes all necessary infrastructure for partner nations to operate independently and satisfy their sovereign requirements, the broader concern has not fully dissipated, especially as geopolitical tensions continue to evolve. Even earlier attempts to address these issues, such as constructing firewalls or limiting certain data flows, have not entirely resolved the underlying question of control. And that question ties back directly into the broader economic picture, because what began as a trade disagreement over tariffs is now influencing decisions in sectors that were never originally part of the conflict, spanning defense, technology, infrastructure, and data governance. Each of these decisions adds another layer to the overall shift, reinforcing the move toward greater self-reliance and reduced dependence on external systems. So how far does this go before it forces a fundamental reset in how the United States and Canada navigate their relationship going forward? Because what is unfolding right now does not resemble a temporary standoff. It looks like the opening stages of a deeper transformation that could redefine the entire relationship. So what do you think? Is this strategy backfiring, or is it simply one chapter in a longer game that is not yet fully played out? And if the pressure continues building on both sides, who do you think bends first? If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening beneath the headlines, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more.